excited to have Alan Austin here in person. For those who may not know, Alan is, of course, IA's illustrious political columnist whose articles are supported by meticulous statistical data. In fact, Alan, someone described one of your pieces just the other day as forensic analysis, which I think sums it up quite well. Tell us about what drives you to research your articles to that degree.
Well, the main motivation is that in Australia, there is so little analysis of what is actually happening to the economy. Those of us who have the chance to visit other countries will have observed that Australia is actually very, very well placed. The Australian economy is one of the most successful right now relative to all other developed countries. But most of this analysis is not reported by the mainstream newsrooms in Australia. And if Australians knew how well Australia's economy was functioning relative to the rest of the world, generally the society would be a lot happier and a lot more confident and less depressed, less anxious, less fearful, and less divided. And so if it's possible to provide information that encourages better awareness, then that's a good thing to do.
That sounds like a good reason to me. And of course, it brings us really to Australia's media, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Tell us first, what drove you to go into journalism?
Yeah, I originally started as a youth worker, and communication was important, and I always had an opinion on things, so I actually started in the media as a cartoonist. I drew cartoons for various journals, including The Age, back in my
Should we get you doing a few more cartoons for us, Alan?
Let me finish the answer to your question. And I was drawing fairly regularly for the Bulletin, The Age, and Nation Review, and I happened to visit an Aboriginal community in North Queensland, and in a small plane, group of 6 of us, and we were all appalled at what we saw. This was back in the Bjelke-Petersen Queensland state government period. Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister, and what was happening to the Indigenous people was frankly appalling. And someone said, Alan, you work in the media. Someone on our team said, you work in the media, you should write about this and get it published. And I offered a piece to the editor of Nation Review, who I knew, and he ran it without edit, at which point I realised I write better than I draw.
I see.
And that was the beginning.
So you're not motivated to add a cartoon here and there every now and then?
No, not anymore.
Well, of course, we do have Mark David's wonderful cartoons
Exactly. No,
at our disposal, which we're also ever grateful for.
No, it was a satisfying period in many respects, but no, there are plenty of people better at that than me.
Well, they were good enough to go in The Age. That can't be too bad. So, but okay, so and then you sort of got a taste for it, is that?
Yes, and I worked as a school teacher for a while, and I just found that it was much more satisfying to be imparting information to people who want to know.
Yep.
And there was a thirst for information that was not being shared by the mainstream newsrooms, particularly about the economy, but also about race relations. My first passion actually was Indigenous affairs, and I did have the opportunity to visit a substantial number of remote Aboriginal communities in my youth, and enable the elected representatives of the Indigenous communities to have their voice heard.
Yeah.
And that was in print and on radio, and that was important because Indigenous affairs was an important issue through the Fraser years. Well, starting with the referendum in 1967. Yep. It's been an issue that's been divisive, and the more voices contributed from Aboriginal people, the elected representatives of the remote communities, the better. And I was able to facilitate that for quite a few decades.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up this idea of the weight given to certain topics by the general media, because what we like to call sometimes the media cartel, but we also call it, let's just call it mainstream media for the purposes of this video. But basically, I think that it sort of also calls into question this idea of objectivity
Yeah.
and how that relates to journalism, and that it's not necessarily independent, which is what people seem to think, simply because you're providing the same story as everybody else, right? What's independent about it is that we don't have any vested interests in IA, and you don't have a vested interest in the sense that you're not paid for by an outside organisation or political group or lobby group, such as the IPA, for example, or, many others that we can name. So I guess what I'm asking is how, because I know people do ask this about your articles as well as about Independent Australia in general. Why do you think it's important, even when everything is pointing in a particular direction, supporting data is supporting I suppose a premise, such as the fact that Labor at the moment are doing very well in the economy? Why do you think it's important to only provide that side of the argument in this equation and not say, but back in whenever the Liberals also had a good economic policy? Why do you think that that's not what we should be doing?
Yes. Well, the reality is that economic outcomes are always substantially better under reformist governments. That's not true only in Australia. It's true in Britain. It's interesting. Some readers of IA might recall an article that you published just before the British election last year, where it was possible to go right back to the end of the Thatcher period, and work out which period in that entire 3 decades, which period actually generated the best economic outcomes for the people of Britain. And the answer was it was Tony Blair. It was a reforming Labor government, and it was evident that in terms of actual numbers like unemployment rate, inflation rate, wealth per person, economic growth, all these outcomes that we look to for an indicator, but also in terms of Britain's ranking in the world, and it went up. All these things went up during the Labor period after many years of the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher, and then after Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown, when they were replaced by the Conservatives under John Major, it went down. Oh no, it might have been John Major, but when Labor was replaced, the economy subsided. It's the same in Australia, but this is masked in Australia by media that will not report.
Yes.
They will not report that economic outcomes decline always under Conservative governments, because they do not decline for the very rich.
No.
And the corporate profits tend to go up. And
advertising goes up.
Yes.
Advertising for media, not for Independent Australia, just throwing that in.
The very wealthy do far better under Conservative governments, and of course newspapers are owned by the very wealthy.
Correct.
And as are the radio stations and the TV stations. So that's the situation, and it's an enormous challenge.
Yeah, sorry, you also touched on this idea that, this was the case in the UK as well. However, Australian media does differ substantially from that in the UK or Europe in general, I think. And you, living in France as you do at the moment, and have done for some years, what do you see as the chief differences between, say, the media in the UK or in France with that in Australia?
Okay, the main problem in Australia, Britain, and the United States is the dominance of News Corporation. The Murdoch family empire is dominant in those 3 countries. In Australia, it owns most of the capital city dailies, but it also influences all the other newsrooms.
Including the ABC.
The Fairfax 9 newsrooms sort of naturally would copy what News Corporation are leading with in the Herald Sun and the Daily Telegraph and the Australian and Sky News. But the ABC also is very largely populated by ex-Murdoch employees, ex-Murdoch executives. The new chairman came straight from the Murdoch Corporation. and the new chief executive, astonishingly, came straight from the Nine TV station. It's just astonishing that all the newsrooms really follow the lead of Rupert Murdoch, and his agenda is twofold: install conservative governments, because conservative governments serve the rich, and keep the population fearful, angry, confused, upset, because that sells newspapers. And that was the success. That was part of the success in the United States of the election of Donald Trump.
True.
That the newspapers discovered that through the first Trump period, newspaper sales absolutely soared. Revenue hit fantastic new records. And after Trump was replaced by Joe Biden, newspaper revenue went down, advertising revenue declined, and so they wanted, let's have more Trump. And they made sure they did get more Trump by refusing to report just how destructive the first Trump period had been, and refusing to report how successful the Biden-Harris administration was in economic management, in controlling the border, in dealing with climate, in dealing with race relations, in dealing with violence, in dealing with all the major issues.
Who cares about those things, Alan? I mean, Trump's going to make them more money. But it's interesting though, because Australia in particular, I think, yes, sure, Murdoch has a very big influence in the States and in the UK. However, in the UK, at least, we know that there is a newspaper for just about every political subgroup, if you like, or every political leaning, every lobbying organisation pretty much has a publication that speaks to their viewpoint or their worldview, if you like. But in Australia, that is certainly not the case.
That's right.
Because we've really only got the duopoly, mainly a monopoly of Murdoch, who's about 70% of all the publications, but also, Sky News, Interesting Radio, and so on and so forth. And of course Nine, as you rightly pointed out before. So, Kevin Rudd, of course, organised a petition in favour of a Murdoch Royal Commission to actually point out how this pretty much colours our entire political landscape and our entire journalistic reporting in this country. And so he called for a Royal Commission into the Murdoch media. Over 500,000 people signed that petition, and it's, I think, the most represented petition ever to go to Parliament. And yet we didn't get a Royal Commission. What is the answer? For this media domination, how can we actually address that? Do you think?
No, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that it's going to be possible in Australia.
All right, that's it, folks.
I know this does sound defeatist, but no, I'm not defeatist. I'm not without hope. I'm not without optimism. But it's going to be a long struggle. Signs of hope are evident in some countries. The second part of the answer to your previous question regarding Europe is that, unlike Australia, America and Britain, countries like France, where I live, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Latin American countries, and most of the Asian countries do have, not all, but most of them do have a range of different voices. Certainly in the developed Western OECD countries, most of the countries do have a range of different voices. It's interesting, in America there were 2 political parties stood for president. In France there were 11.
Right.
And ranging from the the hard right, close the borders, expel the Muslims, right through to parties which market themselves as communist. So you've got all the range. You've got the range in between, and including sort of traditional centre right, Les Républicains, which is a little bit like the Liberal Party or the Republicans in America. And then you've got
I'd have to pull you up there. I don't think the Liberal Party is centre right anymore. I think it's pretty right. But anyway, that's another issue. So. We can't solve it all today.
But unlike Britain, America, Australia, Europe does tend to have a much wider range of voices represented, not just in the political parties, not just in the candidates we can vote for who have a viable chance of getting elected, but in the voices and the opinions that are expressed. And generally, news in Europe is not actually riddled with lies. They cannot get away with malicious falsehoods as the media in Australia do, as the newsrooms in Australia do. And one sign of hope is actually in Liverpool, in Britain, where The Sun, a newspaper run by the Murdoch family, ran a series that was extremely destructive and very, very damaging. And the people of Liverpool said, okay, that's it. No more newspapers. And they have implemented an effective boycott. And any shop that wants to sell Murdoch newspapers, there'll be a sign outside and he won't get any business. He or she won't get any business. Right. And it works. It works. It is possible for consumers to implement a boycotts by refusing...
Voice of the people.
Not just refusing to buy the newspapers that are printed by the Murdoch Corporation, but refusing to support those who advertise.
Yep.
That is the way to affect change.
Yep.
But there doesn't seem to be much appetite in Britain or outside Liverpool or in Australia or in America for that sort of direct action. With regard to government control, that's very, very difficult. That's a very thorny issue. We can't have governments determining, who publishes the news, and I think ultimately it will come back to consumers not deciding that they are not going to tolerate deliberate lies. But
media ownership is another issue that governments can control and make it more equitable, but they choose not to. And certainly successive Liberal governments in Australia have in fact have concentrated media ownership, have introduced policies that have made media ownership even more concentrated in Australia, which is why Murdoch has such a great monopoly here. And I think that is an issue that can be addressed, but is it something that you think Labor could do and still get elected? This is one of the things that's an issue, isn't it?
Yes, it's possible, but it's going to be extremely difficult because all the newsrooms are going to gang up against them.
Yes.
And they're not going to report the reform accurately.
No, that's right.
Labor, I read everything that Dr. Chalmers, the Australia's Treasurer, I read every media release he sends out. I read the transcript of every interview. And his analysis, his commentary, his reasoning, his data is excellent. Excellent. But very little of that ends up being transmitted by the newsrooms.
Yeah,
and people say one of the things that has been frustrating talking to close friends and colleagues here, the problem with the Albanese government is that they're not communicating the message. Well, if you read their media releases, they are. The blockage is not in the Albanese cabinet. The blockage is in the newsrooms that hear what Albanese is saying, and Dr. Chalmers and the other ministers, and just refuse to report it. Or they report it falsely, and that happens far too often also.
That's true. So with Rudd, I suppose we can lead a little bit. I don't want to talk at length about Trump, but I am interested to know, first of all, now that Trump has been elected, of course, and given Kevin Rudd's comments about him in the past, do you think that Kevin Rudd's time as our representative in the US is limited, or do you think that won't factor?
I don't think so. No. I don't think so. Firstly, the comments were made before Mr. Rudd was ambassador, and when Donald Trump was first given the quotes from Kevin Rudd by Nigel Farage, interestingly.
Yes.
He had not heard them.
He's a nice sort of, unbiased person.
Trump pretended that, I know about this guy, I think he's a little bit nasty. Well, Trump had obviously not heard the comments, didn't know who Kevin Rudd was. And Kevin Rudd, as a diplomat, has the capacity to come up with a form of words that will smooth this over. Yeah. I don't think it's an issue.
No, even if it's in Chinese, perhaps.
Yes.
So, okay, Trump. What can we say about that except that I think most progressives, well, most people probably are still in shock that there could be a second term from this person, a convicted criminal,
Yes.
who incited a riot, who, almost led to a civil war and may still lead to a civil war.
Yes.
Do you think that will negatively or positively impact Australia's politics in terms of how people view the world now that Trump is back?
Yes. I don't know. It'll be interesting to observe. I still find it astonishing that the voters preferred Trump again, although I can understand why. But he's not just, a convicted criminal. He's been a criminal grifter all his life. His convictions go back to the 1970s in 5 countries. He's lost court cases to do with his business dealings or tax evasion in 5 countries. And it's just, of course, most Americans don't know that. But how it will affect Australia remains to be seen. This will be a test for the Australian government and the Australian ambassador, including Mr. Rudd, who fortunately is competent in that role. And he was actually an ambassador before he became Prime Minister. So we can be hopeful, optimistic there. But this is not a challenge that Australia faces alone.
No.
And time will tell.
But do you think, may it perhaps lead to a dominance of, the right-wing worldview in Australia as well, because that's been highlighted over there, or do you think it will go the opposite way?
It will certainly be a boost. It will be a confidence booster for the extreme right, the racist right in Australia. And those, conspiracy theorists, those who want to ban vaccines, those who want to pursue...
Craig Kelly's, Babbitt,
Yes.
Pauline Hanson.
Yes. No. The Trump being elected will be a great encouragement to other right-wing political forces, political personalities, and to conspiracy theorists, and to criminals who want to be involved in politics. How destructive that will be for Australia or other countries remains to be seen. But it's possible. I'm optimistic that Australia can navigate this without too much harm. At least at this stage, Australia has not been targeted for tariffs, as have Canada, Mexico, China, and some.
Not yet, anyway.
Not yet, anyway. And this government actually has got an impressive record of recovering from the trade boycotts that were implemented by China and other countries. Yes, Australia, just in the last 2.5 years, this government has, in fact, the exports from Australia have just hit, for the first time ever, 27% of GDP. That's the first time that's happened, and that's largely because this government has restored trade embargoes that had been imposed under the previous regime, partly for political reasons. I love how you have those statistics at your fingertips too, by the way. Well, I'm impressed. It was an all-time high, so economists should notice all-time highs. Yes, and true. Under this government, there have been a few. They have indeed. So, what do you think, with the election coming up, how do you see Labor's chances of being re-elected? I think especially given the hostility in the media. Trump. Yes. No, I think the chances are pretty good. History tells us that first-time governments are not thrown out usually, or have never been thrown out. It's not just usually. Every government that has been elected for the first time, going back to Whitlam, well, we can go through them: Whitlam, Fraser, Hawke, Keating. Howard, Gillard, they were all re-elected. They were all re-elected when they were first up. So history gives Albanese and his team that basis for confidence. If the truth was told about how this government is travelling relative to the rest of the world, given the global conditions, it's been impressive. It has been impressive. So there's no real basis to throw them out for failure to deliver. They have delivered. So I would be optimistic. The risk, of course, is that voters simply do not know. They are told lies after lies after lies. They are fed falsehoods day after day, and they will believe them. That's the risk, that's the challenge, and that's why independent Australia is important.
Absolutely, can't argue with that one. So tell us, Alan, do you have a mantra that you live by? Is there an overriding, kind of motto for Alan Austin?
Well, one reason I'm here in Australia right now is to visit my children and grandchildren. I know you're thinking I'm not old enough, but yes, I have grandchildren, and I want the world to be I want them to enjoy. I had a great life growing up in Australia. Australia is a fantastic place. It's a great place, and I suppose, wanting an informed electorate to elect representatives who will make the country fairer and more egalitarian, more accepting of people who are different, the better. I guess that's the underlying principle: wanting the nation to be as effective and as welcoming and as harmonious as possible.
I like it. And so, given that, what sort of topics are you looking to cover over the next coming columns?
Well, the focus for the next few months will be Australia's election, and it will be a focus on how the media are distorting the reality. And I'm actually taking the chance while I'm here to read newspapers that I would not pay to subscribe to, and I cannot buy, or I cannot read in libraries in France. Here in Melbourne,
thank goodness, is all I have to know. No, it's still important for us to stay informed. But
here in Melbourne, I can read all the newspapers for free, and I'm making a note of those that routinely lie about the economy, and I'm taking the chance while I'm here to refer some of these to the Australian Press Council in the hope that they will change their policy of a lifetime and start exposing some of the economic misrepresentation. But we'll see what happens. We will see. I'm hopeful, but not confident. And but it will be pretty much a focus on the disinformation campaign between now and the election, which will be before May this year.
Sounds like just up our alley. Thank you so much, Alan Austin, for speaking to Independent Australia today. And so nice to have you in Australia for this interview.
It's been a pleasure.